And my third and final point about this process is that erased or forgotten layers may be rediscovered or brought back into visibility in landscapes. Often this is in response to loss or change or some other circumstance in the present. This is a really interesting process to me, and a couple of points I just want to mention about it. First is that how these recovered or restored layers are received and whether they're even noticed, it tends to depend not on their any kind of intrinsic value, but on the current conditions, the political and cultural relationships and relationships of power in the surrounding community and culture at the time. And the second thing, and this is really the counterintuitive part of this process, is that these processes of preserving and commemorating may also kind of paradoxically involve processes of destruction and further loss. We think of this as really always saving and preserving, but often it involves erasing in different ways. So I just wanted to talk a little bit to finish about how this has happened in some of these different layers of Salem's history, the witches, the schooners, the polkas, all of this. So colonial history in Salem was really brought back into visibility in a big way by a woman, primarily a woman named Caroline Emerton, and other fairly elite members of the Yankee classes in Salem. And this was largely and ironically in response to the great influx of immigrants from Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, like the Poles who were coming into the neighborhood. What Caroline Emerton did was to create essentially a little colonial compound structured around the House of the Seven Gables, which Nathaniel Hawthorne had written a very famous novel about. So she took a house that more or less is the House of Seven Gables, opened it as a historic site around 1910, but also as a settlement house, which was kind of a social service organization that was geared to helping immigrants. And this was also kind of a paradoxical thing because the Yankee elites at this time were both helping the immigrants and also kind of reinforcing their own sense of what America was and what it should be. So it was both directed at social reform and social activism, but also kind of social preservation and conservation of traditional Yankee culture. Maritime history was brought back into visibility along the Derby Street, Derby Wharf neighborhood, largely via the National Park. And this was starting in the 1930s in the depths of the Depression. It has obviously become a fairly popular activity today. Many post-industrial places or formerly depressed places will reinvest in their waterfronts, harbor fronts, as a way to draw new kinds of visitors and tourists, and sometimes residents as well. But ironically, when the national park came in order to restore the wharf area, they demolished quite a lot of the Polish neighborhood that existed right along the wharf. They took down a lot of buildings and kind of gutted the core of that neighborhood in some ways. And the House of the Seven Gables did the same thing. In creating her colonial compound, Caroline Emerton actually knocked down quite a lot of the triple-deckers, the tenements, the buildings where the Poles actually lived and danced and drank and had their social life. So there's two institutions, the National Park and the House of Seven Gables, that in different ways have both been really important to Poles in Salem, but have also themselves contributed to this ongoing sort of preservation/destruction of the Polish neighborhood. And then more recently, witch history has been brought back fairly ambivalently in some ways in Salem, starting in the 1970s, really when industry was really tanking in the New England area. Tourism and heritage were seen as something of a replacement, both to kind of build up local esteem and pride and to attract new investment, new businesses, new residents. So Derby Street at this point is quite a touristy area, particularly in the summer. The old triple-deckers have been converted at fantastic prices to condominiums, largely for people who work in Boston and so are commuters in this neighborhood. There are really not a lot of visible signs of the Polish presence of the people who lived here for really a couple of generations in the neighborhood or in the city at large. And I doubt that the study that I'm working on is going to change that drastically. Salem sort of has this established iconic set of things that are remembered in the landscape. So this really is sort of inserting a little something into that landscape, but I doubt, I'd be very surprised if it sort of took off in a big way. But it really is part of an ongoing set of small-scale ways just to remind the newcomers, the tourists, various people in Salem that the poles were there and are there, that there are still actually a few people who've lived in the neighborhood for a very long time, and there's kind of a local diaspora of people in the greater Salem area who have attachments to the St. Joseph Hall and to the neighborhood and to the city in general. So there are some small-scale things that we can see in the landscape. For example, there's a small park that was created in memory of one of the first Salem Polish American city councilors. There's an exhibit in the window of the St. Joseph Hall, which uses photographs that some are in the park's collection, some are from people in the community that were brought to the park. And then there's the project that I'm working on, and we're trying to figure out now what exactly this will contribute to. We're going to try to sort of convene some social gatherings at the hall, bring people together just to be social, which is exactly the purpose of these sites in the first place, but also to create some kind of an archive. And I'm hoping that actually this will work toward a digital archive, which is something that most institutions with collections now are thinking about. It just makes it accessible in another way. And in an interesting way, it adds kind of a digital layer to this set of landscapes that we live in. So you might think of a palimpsest that also has a kind of a virtual layer as well as the various physical layers that exist. So here we are back at the hall where we started. Thanks very much for viewing the presentation. I hope it's encouraged you to look at the places around you in perhaps some new ways, and to ask whether there are any overlapping or invisible or recovered layers in your own landscapes. And please remember to join me in the threaded discussion area to tell me about those or to share any other thoughts you may have. Bye.